local authorities and other areas of what's available for, particularly for grants and funding. I'll kick off with my little story, which is going to be 15 minutes or so, and then I'm going to manage the timings throughout. As I say, any questions as well, please post those as well into the chat. So, introduce myself again to those who've just joined us. So, my name is Ian Bocock. I'm based in Salford in Greater Manchester, and my journey into green and growing groups, I suppose, started prior to my incredible edible journey. My background as a sixth form tutor in a special needs college, we were doing sort of green and growing activities, and for me it's always been very obvious the benefits of being outdoors, growing produce, being engaged with nature. My background initially was special needs, so it was very obvious the benefits to certainly the young people I was working with. And I looked into Incredible Edible back in 2013, so it's coming up for nearly 10 years ago, and went and did a visit to the home of the IE movement in Sonderden, and came back to Salford and decided to have a go at launching an Incredible Edible movement. And it was only 12 months into that sort of journey. The initial hurdle and obstruction was about, and it might be most people this will resonate with, is the idea of insurance. Everybody starts to question it. Well, this is great that we're doing green and growing activities, but we're engaging with the public, and what's our liability with regards to making sure that people are safe? My experience has been that some local authorities, if you engage with them, will be able to use their insurance to cover groups, but then that's not always the case. So then people were starting to look for funding, small amounts of funding to cover insurance, and that, I suppose, has been one of the major hurdles for a lot of groups that start to question, well, what we're doing, public realm, how do we protect people? So just as a thumbs up, is that the sort of thing that people are coming across, that insurance has been a hurdle to progressing with your green and growing groups? I think you can do a thumb. Yeah, well, those people who are still on screen, I can see thumbs up, and you can also do a thumbs up, I think, on the screen. Can't you? Thank you, Sue Jeffries. Hello, Sue. Nice to see you, or not to see you, but I can see your thumb up. So yeah, those are the initial things, and then in 2014. We, as Incredible Edible Salford, at that time I was still employed at the local college, we were looking at trying to get grants and funding to enable us to deliver services. And we're really lucky, Salford, that we have Salford CBS, and Martin's going to tell you more in his presentation about what is on offer, certainly in the Salford area, and actually probably more regionally as well for the Northwest. And as we started to get funding in place, we were a small grassroots group with lots of people involved, but at different levels of what they wanted to achieve as part of that group. And we experienced at that time that there were some people within that small board and group. We were a constituted group, but people weren't happy about the handling of larger funds of money. So £500 pots were quite nice, and they were good for getting insurance and small bits of equipment. But then the issue came along that, well, how do we deliver more sessions, more access? And then you're looking for larger amounts of funding. And the organisation, as it was at the time as a constituted group, people became uncomfortable with those larger amounts. So that's something to sort of take on board, is that there may be certain people within your groups and organisations who've got bigger, higher aspirations. There might be others who are quite happy at keeping the group sort of as a low-key grassroots operation. And that led to us really, as a breakout, creating Incredible Education, CIC, which is who I work for today. So it brings us to that question about being constituted or not, or moving on to create another entity that can then apply for pots of funding. So one of those sort of problems is that bit of, do you become constituted? Do you have to be constituted? No, you don't. But if you are a constituted group and you are registered with your local organisations, then it becomes a lot easier to achieve funding. And that then leads on for us, and my experience has been over the last 8 years that we've been trading as a CIC, is that you want to be able to also not be wholly reliant on funding. And certainly over the period of COVID, when you weren't able to generate income, or certainly we had difficulty in generating income, that applying for funding was a necessity. But as an organisation, we have managed over the majority of our existence to be able to operate with a 70% income from activities and produce and products that we can sell, so that we're only reliant on about 30% of income funding to ensure that we are sustainable. I suppose that's what we're trying to get across from this evening's presentation, is about becoming sustainable. So as a grassroots organisation, we became Incredible Education, and we started to offer our services mainly initially through horticulture and therapy through horticulture, sort of health and well-being. But we also then bolted on forest school activities. So somebody else joined the organisation who had that experience in early years and then trained to be a forest school facilitator. So having that blend of income is really important, but you're obviously relying on that income and being able to generate that income over a period of time. So having a number of different income streams is, again, fundamental to that success. So other than our sale of services and products, we then worked hard towards achieving a location that was going to be able to be used by us as a base. And again, I'm sure this sort of resonates with most people, is, well, where do we operate from? What is it we're using currently? For us, our local authorities, so Salford City Council, were amazing at and supported us in finding a home. So again, that's one to investigate, is your local authorities and the idea of asset transfers. But again, it all depends on how big organisations want to or what are the grassroots groups want to sort of expand to. So that mix of self-generated income and grants is great. The perfect example, and I'll acknowledge this to Gary, because we speak and spoken often, is the perfect example of a social enterprise is an organisation that is actually selling a product or a service and then uses that income or that surplus income to do good in their community. The perfect is 100% of your income comes from sales of services, products, and you then go on and use some of that profit to deliver. For us, we're not that route. We are, as I say, roughly a 70-30 split of self-generated income and grant funding. As you move on and develop, then it might be that you look into things like social investment. So again, have a look at social investment. We've invested into our community cafe through the GMCVO, so we got some social investment. Social investment for us at that point through GMCVO was part grant and part loan, and it's a bit scary going down that route, because for 5 years we never had to borrow money, or we hadn't gone down that route of borrowing money, but we wanted to generate another income stream, and that was creating our community cafe. So by borrowing that money over a period of time, which also helped in effect that the money, although it comes along with an interest whacked onto it, by the time you've had your grant elements, you're sort of just paying back the actual capital. You're not paying back capital plus the interest. So might be worth investigating and looking into that if that's something that's a route that you want to go on. But I say it all depends on where you are in your journey. So that bolts on of additional income streams. So we now have a cafe that we run, which is partly staffed by ourselves and through volunteers. We have children's birthday party packages. So the picture behind my head at the moment is our Forest School garden, which was an old plant nursery in Salford. We now do packages around children's birthday parties. We do a stay and play session on a Tuesday morning, and we can sell those services and then use that income to deliver our other volunteer programs, and also to hopefully continue our social prescription programs, which are currently funded, but we want to expand on those. And you can use that social prescription as we're sort of trying to introduce now. We're actually introducing a forest school for big kids, and the idea about that is sort of bringing people around food, growing food, cooking food, sharing food together. But then that also gets people to know your location, your group, and hopefully they might bring friends and family along. And again, it all spreads that news of what it is that you're doing as an organisation. So it's been a challenging period, I suppose, that last 2 or 3 years through COVID. Interestingly enough, during that period, and I don't know whether again this is something that echoes with other people, is we saw that from our 70-30 of income generated and our grants, it flipped the other way around over that COVID period from 2020 to 22, that we actually ended up more fund and grant reliant as we lost our schools work, our older people's connections groups. But that now has sort of flipped back in the last 12 months, so we're now allowed to be back together and meeting up. So yeah, it's been an interesting period of time. It is a very sort of personal journey for me, but it's been one that's been assisted by lots of other people. We have a great board, we have brilliant volunteers, and we have some great freelancers who can also help us. And that's another one sort of mention, is that if you're looking at making a leap to trying to make yourself sustainable more from that sort of social enterprise aspect, is that being able to use freelance rather than having to employ people. Our next journey, I suppose, is looking at how do we employ more than the 2 core employees that we have at the moment. And I suppose that's part of the scary bit as we move forward. So that's my sort of resume of our journey over the last 8 years. I'm available for anybody who wants to email and ask questions in the future. That's not a problem. I say any questions, just pop them into the chat. And we're now going to move on and introduce Gary, who's going to chat to us about his experience, certainly particularly in the social enterprise sector, but again, a lot of knowledge around the support that he and we and the Incredible Edible Network have provided to core groups and grassroots groups. So over to you, please, Gary.
Thanks very much, Ian. Great to see you, everyone. And Ian and Claire and everyone else who didn't invite me, thank you very much for inviting me, because somebody did. So it's really good to see you, and thank you so much for the invitation. As Ian said, we got to know each other because for the last 8 years, I've been a director of an organisation called Incredible Edible CIC, which is the kind of network body for our 150 Incredible Edible groups across the UK. And through doing that work, Ian and I did some work together. And I'm going to start with just a little bit of a précis, I think, of my learning there, and then go on to just a little bit of stuff about the work that I've been doing for the last 30 years, I suppose, in social enterprise. So some of you will probably be aware, Incredible Edible is a network, a federated network of 150 groups. There are, thank you so much, CIC stands for Community Interest Company, and I'm really happy to flesh out some of those bits when I've just chatted a bit about social enterprise in a moment. Incredible Edible is a federated network of 150 groups across the UK that are hugely diverse, from 2 or 3 friends who do a little bit of community land growing on a weekend together, to more formal structures where people have got commission services that they deliver on behalf of local authorities and various other institutions. So there's a whole range of organisations, from the very, very smallest group of volunteers who just come together under a common umbrella to do something great for the planet and for their community, to those organizations that have got paid staff and a network of people delivering various projects. And so I've learned a huge amount by being involved in that huge network of groups. So a little bit about sustainability, a little bit about the myths of sustainability, and a little bit about the wide variety of aspiration within those grassroots groups. Ian mentioned a little bit earlier on of some of the work that I've done. I suppose I began my career as a housing support worker and became the chief executive of a homeless charity. Then I went to work for national government on a national programme of transformation in UK homelessness services called the Places of Change programme back in the late 90s, because I feel really old now. And as a result of doing some of that work, first got involved in this idea of social enterprise. So I'm going to share 2 slides with you, if the magic works. One is kind of my journey through social enterprise through a few pictures, and then my learnings from social enterprise through just a few kind of lessons. And so the first slide is my life over the last 20 or 30 years, I suppose, in a few pictures. I came from a background of working in the voluntary sector with work that was focused on people who had experienced homelessness and or were leaving prison. And as a result of that experience in the voluntary sector, I got together with a few friends to look at social enterprise as a vehicle for delivering a sustainable impact. And one of the early social enterprises was a vintage boutique, which sold vintage clothing products and had concessions for local makers and artists. And then opened a social enterprise that had 5 or 6 cafes, a catering facility that did 1,000 lunchtime orders a day to corporate sector clients, and had a restaurant that was listed in the Michelin Guide. And within that business network, we had 500 people who had experienced homelessness a year on a 12-week training program, 86% of which left that program into full-time work. So that was some of my early experience. For the last 10 years, I've founded and run a social enterprise seeking to deliver impact in the area of food security. We started off 9 years ago. We started off planning it 10 years ago, but 9 years ago in a South Yorkshire village, and have opened 10 community shops. We opened our 11th in November. And those shops are a standard kind of social supermarket model where we have 800 to 900 product lines in a standard convenience type store, which we supply from the UK supply chain surplus. So this is food which hasn't got to supermarkets, which would be ending up going into landfill, and we rescue it at the point of the manufacturers. We buy some of that product, some of it's donated, and so we're able to offer a convenience store which has 800 to 900 product lines across all the major categories of food and non-food and personal care and frozen and fresh and chilled, but it's 30% of the retail price. So it aims to work with that group of families who are not yet in chronic food insecurity, but are part of the 7.3 million families in the UK who are skipping at least one meal a week in order to balance the budgets and put food on the table for the family. We make a profit from the sale of the food, even though it's 30% of the retail price, and our customers save £212 a month on the shopping bill. But we use the profits from the sale of that food to run on the same site a community cafe and cookery school where kids eat free, and we serve breakfast and lunch 6 days a week and run a cookery school program to help people feel confident around food, and a community hub that runs 11 different personal development and mentoring programs to help people develop their personal, emotional and economic resilience. And we pay for the staff and the chefs and the mentors in those two spaces through the profits that we make from the sale of food in our community shops. We've got about 120 staff working across those 10 different locations, and we are fortunate enough that it balances the budget and we're able to make some surplus profits in order to invest in those communities where we sell the food. So my experience is quite wide-ranging, from clothing retail, which looks great on the picture, but we were absolutely diabolical at it. And you can ask me any questions about that and what didn't go right, through hospitality into retail. But I think one of the things that you'll probably see in all of those examples of kind of my experience in social enterprise is that they are all social impact models which are based on a standard retail paradigm. And therefore, in terms of the lessons that I've learned, and there's a few of them which I'll just rattle through, but then at the end, I'm really happy to answer any questions. I think the first lesson that I've learned is that social enterprise as a sector isn't magic. So I'm not an expert from Social Enterprise UK, but there are well over 100,000 social enterprises in the UK, putting about £3 billion into GDP. These are for purpose and not-for-profit organisations, large and small, around the UK. But they all share a similar kind of DNA. But I think the first lesson that I've learned is that social enterprise isn't magic. Over the years, I've gone to lots and lots and lots of community centres who very proudly have said to me, well, what we're going to do is we've got a building and it's not doing very well, and there's a kind of cafe space and there are not that many people coming in and we're struggling to make it sustainable. So we're going to turn it into a social enterprise. As if by saying the word social enterprise, somehow magically something will happen. But of course, it doesn't magically happen. It's just a way of doing business where you take the profits and reinvest it in community benefit. But on its own, the idea of being a social enterprise isn't some magic bullet towards sustainability. For me, my learning has been that sustainability through social enterprise, and there are other methods of sustainability in the not-for-profit sector, but sustainability through social enterprise is often well achieved if you understand, if you're able to define your product or your service. So Ian's just been speaking. I've been working with Ian for a good number of years. He's got a 70-30 split of the 70% earned income. A big chunk of that is through contracted educational services. So that's a service that people pay for. And then there's the sale of some products of plants and horticultural equipment and cafe services and stuff. But there's a nice hybrid mix of the sale of products and services as well as some grant funding. But Ian, like many other social entrepreneurs, really have been quite careful to define what that product or service is that they are selling to a sector that wants to buy that product and service to create that sustainability. And then my second key, I think, is to really understand what your product or service is. So the reason that my beautiful vintage boutique failed is because we didn't know what we were doing. We had never sold vintage clothes in our lives before. We just thought it was a great route to create jobs for people who had experienced homelessness and wanted to move into employment. But we didn't understand that world. When we opened the catering business and the restaurant, I went to Harvey Nichols and I talked to their executive chef and I said, do you want a job? because I need somebody who really understands this sector to lead it. So I want somebody with amazing skills, but also a passionate heart that can deploy those skills, delivering a product or service which exists entirely for social benefit and not for profit. But we needed to recruit the right people who really understood that product or service. My fourth lesson is really understand the numbers. And for those of us who spent a lot of years in the voluntary sector, understanding your profit and loss sheet, your cash flow is not something that always comes fully naturally to people, but understanding and staying in control of the numbers, the money that flows around your organization is utterly vital, even if you're not doing it for profit. And I would argue, especially if you're not doing it for profit, it's even more important to understand those basic fundamental principles of how cash works in your organization. The fifth, I think, learning for me is to understand the right legal structure for you. There are a huge range of not-for-profit legal structures that I'm sure Martin will come on to. A social enterprise is an umbrella name for all sorts of types of legal structures. There are community benefit societies and a whole range of other types of legal structure. And talk to people across the sector to understand what, if you do want to start to develop and grow a sustainable enterprise, what is the right legal structure for the thing that you're trying to achieve? The work that I've done for the last 20 or 30 years, social enterprise as an umbrella fitted well for it, but there are lots of other types of legal structure that can work better. One of the last few lessons for me is to align your social value proposition with your core service offer. So in the vast majority of social enterprises that I founded and run, the social value proposition was pretty much the same as the core product or service offer. So in a restaurant setting, our social value proposition is people who are coming out of prison or are experiencing homelessness often have a better long-term future if they can get a job. And therefore, creating a restaurant or cafe space where people can learn the skills through a 12-week training course that we could pay for from selling plates of food, created a long-term social impact for the people who were experiencing homelessness going through our training academy. But it was directly aligned with the job that we were doing, which is creating food and putting it on people's plates. And in the community shop model, we were able to retail food, which directly impacted on day one people experiencing food insecurity, and use the profits in order to invest in those individuals and families so that they were no longer dependent on food aid for any longer than was absolutely necessary. The next one is to understand your brand proposition and your unique selling points. So the thing that you do, what is unique about it, and how does your sellable proposition, we're really good at selling seeds, and we use the profits from that to do this social good thing. How do those two fit together to create a compelling proposition that people want to buy from you more than they want to buy from anybody else in your sector? And there's a really powerful combination between a great quality product and the social value. So one of the businesses that I'm incredibly impressed with is a small business called Rubies in the Rubble. And Rubies in the Rubble take a load of rotting fruit that comes out of Borough Market, and they have a workforce entirely made up of socially isolated women who are victim survivors of domestic abuse often, who make that into premium brand jams and chutneys that is listed on the shelves of Ocado and Waitrose and Fortnum and Mason. So they've got a high quality product that they sell, but a social impact alongside making that product that gives them a really powerful, unique selling point. People want to buy that product rather than one that's mass produced somewhere on minimum wage. And my last two call outs really are the beware ones, which is The first is beware the heady vanity of growth. That once you land up on a good idea and people think it looks a bit exciting, they want you to grow it lots. And sometimes that's the right thing to increase the impact and sustainability, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes small is beautiful, and just sticking to your knitting and doing the thing that you're doing in the place that you call home is good enough. But people often, when you land on a good idea, want you to grow that. And sometimes it can create problems for yourself. And the final bit of lesson from me is to beware of investment. Ian touched right at the end of his bit about the investment that they've taken in. Some investment that people want to offer to sustainable social enterprises is absolutely brilliant and just the right thing that people need. Some of it is crippling finance that you end up paying back for years and years, and it's much more in the interest of the social investment specialist who's wanted you to take the finance than it is for you. So as my old mother used to say, have eyes in your backside. She didn't say backside, she said a worse word than that, but I don't want to say it online. When it comes to people wanting to offer growth and investment when you've had a little good idea, because it can be the making of you, but it can be the thing that can cripple you. So lots of good stuff. But a couple of kind of warnings at the end about once you've made it sustainable, what people might want to do next. And that's me done. So I am going to stop sharing, and then Ian doesn't need to shout at me for going over time.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was great. Thank you. Great insight. And just to go back on that thing about the social investment, that we took out that social investment prior to us being blighted by COVID. But we were in a fortunate position that we had some existing funding from a private source of income and donation that we were able to utilise. And if I'm being honest, I probably wouldn't have gone down that route. As a board, we agreed that we would go down that route, and I was probably more influential at the time of deciding to do that. So again, if anybody's got any questions with regards to ways of generating income and going through social investment, then please do drop us a line. I've been trying to answer some of the questions in the chat. Apologies if I didn't catch everybody. Most of you have just done a private response. Certainly a few questions about where do you get funding from, and the one that always pops up is that funding for social prescription seems to stay inside the sort of the NHS sector. And again, what we've found is, and certainly by my friendships and relationships across the region of the Northwest with different groups, is that every different local authority, or whether or not it be a smaller sort of parish council or whatever it might be, everybody just has a different structure. So unfortunately, having a good brick wall to bang your head against is great. Just have that there ready to go, because you will get frustrated. We are really, really fortunate in Salford that we have Salford CVS, who have managed for many years an NHS budget. So in answer to some of those questions and the right-hand column, yes, sometimes it's difficult to get your funding, but your local authority has got to be your best route, really. Find your person within your local council. We have neighbourhood managers within Salford, so again, try and track down your equivalent of a neighbourhood manager. They quite often have small pots of funding. So within our local authority, we have what's called the devolved budget, which is an annual budget for doing local community work. So that's one to look out for. And also your housing associations. So again, we've got a number of housing associations. I'm just looking at Martin's face, Martin, because I probably covered up all the stuff he's going to be talking about.
I would just like to thank you for covering about 50% of what I'm about to.
No. Well, you can reiterate. So yeah, it's that question. And to be honest, I've had this discussion many times with Salford CVS and others about that unfortunately sometimes the funding is too short a term for us to be able to plan ahead. And Gary was saying then about having, as a smaller group, yes, you don't have to have that increase in activity if what you're doing works really well and is making such a difference, that you manage to get through with a small budget. But sometimes having funding for more than 6, 9, 12 months is what you might need to make yourself know that you can deliver a service. And interestingly enough, there's an organisation within Greater Manchester who were given a presentation at an event I was at the other day, who've got funding coming directly from their local authorities, from the council, for them to, and they utilise that fund to employ somebody who then works with the grassroots organisations. So there's so many different operations going on out there, which, to be honest, is probably just funding alone is another meeting and a night of discussion, but that will go on and on and on and on and on. So, Martin, apologies for cutting in on some of your stuff, but please do repeat if need be. Thank you.
By all means, thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Great to be here, actually, and as part of this wonderful discussion. I'll just give you a bit of background about myself. Like I say, my name's Martin Wilcock, and I work for Salford Community and Voluntary Services, and my role within Salford CVS is a green space development worker. My role is actually funded through a programme run by NHS and the Clinical Commissioning Group about developing green space activities for mental health and well-being. Prior to this, I've worked in the social enterprise sector for about 20 years now, having been a project manager for good old-fashioned Business Link in the sort of early 2000s, where we actually developed a programme to support community organisations called Action for Community Enterprise, which was a project that ran across in East Lancashire as part of East Lancashire's Business Link. Following on from there, I then became one of the founding directors, I think there was 10 of us, of the Social Enterprise Network in Lancashire, CELNET, which is still going strong. They've still got annual awards. They still do things like exhibitions and trade fairs, and they manage a number of different programs supporting social enterprises across the rest of Lancashire. But I moved over to Manchester and worked at Salford University as a part-time lecturer, and also helping in the careers service about people setting up small businesses, in particular social enterprises. So that led me, like I say, unfortunately during the pandemic, I was made redundant from that role, but never mind. But then I landed this job at Salford CVS. So the nice part about that is I was working with a number of the organisations that I'd already met through working at Salford University, etc. I could hit the ground running, and that was that. So one of the things that we've developed is we've actually, what Salford and Greater Manchester is one of 7 pilot areas that Ian's mentioned before in the UK about social prescribing, and that's money that's been put into these different areas to look to develop and explore different models of delivering social prescribing. And the long-term aim of social prescribing is the reduction of non-medical appointments at the GP practices, addressing things like anxiety, isolation, etc., where people have just really going to the GPs for a bit of additional support, where quite often this can be treated by non-clinical treatment processes. So social prescribing then, and my role, I've got 2 colleagues that work with the non-green element of social prescribing, so that can be developing programs such as, you know, coffee and natter, knitting groups, dancing with dementia, all sorts of other different programs that they operate. But my role is primarily around the green and blue, which is to do with water activities. So we have actually commissioned a number of different activities. So things like horticulture is delivered in, I think it's about 7 different sites across the city, Ian's site being one of them. And we wanted to get a really good both geographical range, because we've got Salford's quite a big city, range, where it borders obviously with sort of Manchester and Bury, and goes right the way out across the Mosses to where it borders up with Warrington. So we've delivered, so we wanted to have a broad range of activities in a number of different locations. So we've commissioned things like horticulture, some conservation projects, a program for bees for well-being, nature-based walks in various different locations with different partner organisations, arts in nature, green woodworking, even a climate cafe, climate anxiety cafe, and obviously, the latest one is Ian's Forest School for Big Kids. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that takes off. One of the key things about this, though, is working with organisations, and I can't express enough about the value of things like networking and working with other organisations. So it's really important to try and find out what is happening in your area, who are the key players. Obviously, you should hopefully have some sort of equivalent of a CVS organisation, so an organisation that supports community and faith and voluntary and social enterprise organisations. But also there'll be some people within the local council that you need to be working with. I take on that role for many of the organisations within Salford. So I have regular meetings with things like the council officers, looking at things like potential green space development work. But I also link with other organisations such as the local community leisure services, the university at Salford, with things like RHS Bridgewater, Great Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership, and then other green organisations which cover a bigger area such as Groundwork, Solar City, City of Trees, Lancashire Wildlife Trust, the Prince's Trust, etc. So you need to make it so somebody within your local area needs to be making those strategic links to develop these networks so that information can be shared, best practice can be shared, and people are informed about the latest support mechanisms, etc. One of the main things I coordinate is a forum within Salford, Salford Environment Forum, and we have had 4 meetings since the pandemic. Which started, so we have the first of the meetings within December last year, and then we've had one in April, July, and the last one was last Friday, where we get things like key speakers in. We try and visit an organisation that can, obviously, a green project. So they've got some green but nature-based activities on that site, etc. So the latest one that we had was at a place called Ordsall Hall, and we had 42 people attending that network. And again, that's great for people being able to network, share ideas, make new contacts, etc. And also start trading. Part of that thing, trading socially between different social organisations. Following on from there, we're looking at developing some peer support networks, around community food growing, obviously, which is of interest of people on this, but also ones around things like friends of groups, so friends of various different parks, and there's a number of those across the city, country parks, even local green spaces, even friends of things like a train station, where people go along and plant, either some edibles or just flowers, just to enhance the environment, etc. there. And the final one being around beekeepers, because I think I've come across 14 beekeepers across the city of Salford so far. Many of them produce their own local honey, which is obviously, and it's obviously part of the ecosystem with things like pollination, etc. So again, I think that's really important to get those networks up and running, so see who facilitates any local networks, and make sure that you're part of that community. I'll come more onto the networks in a minute. But one of my other roles is to do with bringing derelict space back into use across the city. So there's 3 different projects, a minimum of 3 that I'm working on at the moment, within things like bringing a disused allotment back into public use, but there's got to be an element of community use on it. It's not just going to be brought back to benefit X number of families, you know, there's got to be a community element of use on that space. Also looking at a community, well, so I think they're working with 2 different allotments on creating community food growing projects, and also some smaller organisations such as some dead space at the back of an old library to make an outdoor reading room, for example, is another project that we've been working on at the moment. But my role also covers other areas. So things like, you know, health initiatives such as walking, running, park run, cycling, which is very, you know, active travel, which is very disjointed with across the city at the moment. So there's things that to do there, but then obviously other sort of like recycling initiatives around furniture, etc. So a whole host of different activities. Moving on to things like how your organizations can be more sustainable. That's an interesting one because things vary quite dramatically from local authority to local authority. So a couple of key points that I would say is, first of all, make sure that you engage with your local CVS type organization. And again, that will vary. So try and find out who that is. They're really good at covering things like your legal structures, governance, etc. We support organisations through all that. Within Salford, if anybody applying for any funding that we manage through Salford CVS, and we manage, you know, probably about £2 or £3 million of the funding a year, mostly based around health-related outcomes through the clinical commissioning group. They need to be a member of Salford CVS before they can apply for that funding, because that's part of the due diligence about checking their governance, bank account details, etc. So that we're making sure that, because some of this is public funded money, it's going to bona fide organisations. There might be a social enterprise network that you can join within your local area. And there'll certainly be some sort of business support agency. So make sure that you engage with all those different people. They can offer different help. They can open the doors for things like different funding, etc. And like I said, the majority of the funding that we get through Salford CVS is to manage funds on behalf of the NHS in some different guise, so various departments within the NHS, because the community-based groups that we work with understand those communities better than a national a big corporate organization such as the NHS. So we can get those hard to reach communities, certainly on sort of like healthy lifestyle initiatives, etc. So there are now funding being put into things like social prescribing, of which horticulture is a really key part of that, through things like the clinical commissioners, and even the primary care networks of realising the benefit of nature-based solutions to people's mental health and well-being. There's been plenty of research about it, and they're actually investing in that to be able to benefit the patients that each of these primary care networks support. As far as funding goes, it's a really fractured picture, I suppose. There are obviously things like big national charities that you can look out for, the Tudor Trust, for example. Each of them has different priorities that change on a mid-term basis, probably every sort of 5 years. They'll look at different elements where they'll be looking at supporting different, types of activities. You've got obviously things like local charitable trusts, and again, something like one of the infrastructure organisations such as the CVS will be able to help you find local charitable trust organisations to apply for small pots of funding. Obviously, you've then got things like the National Lottery, and simple things like Awards for All project. Most community organisations are suitable for applying for Awards for All. Moving up the funding scale, things like Reaching Communities programme will fund an element of, will fund posts for community development work. And possibly your organisation might be eligible for things like the Climate Action Fund, depending on what type of activities you're going. And that's a brand new fund that's come out from the National Lottery to fund, obviously, sustainability through, climate, changing the, climate action activities. As previous people, Gary mentioned before, look at obviously a funding cocktail. Really, organisations survive off a funding cocktail. You know, grants are no longer a freebie. They are usually a contract to deliver some sort of service on behalf of another organisation. You are paying. You are buying off a different organisation some of their outcomes. They're paying you to deliver their outcomes. So, but obviously, what other activities can you trade? Ian's given some fantastic examples of the type of trading activity that they do to make up their funding cocktail. And I would probably say Ian's funding cocktail is probably more than 70% actually, because of some of the grants are really sort of like contracts to deliver work in some way, shape or form. Finally, sort of coming on to things like marketing. Gary covered this quite well before, very well before, obviously as well. But one of the things that the social enterprise sector is very poor on is marketing in their brand. And quite often their literature is not up to scratch because sometimes the user or the funder of the service is not necessarily the user of the service. So you sometimes need to have almost like two pieces of literature to attract people to your service. One specifically aimed at funders and one specifically aimed at the service user who's going to use your organisation and your service. So, like I say, it's a different picture across the country. Each different area will have a different method of support for things like, mentioned things like social prescribing before. But what's really important is to link in with those necessary with those local networks to understand what's happening in your local patch. They'll know who to speak to. Look at forming partnerships with other organisations, collaborative work, and then obviously hopefully we'll get some better outcomes for all concerned. So that's a bit of a sort of a quick overview of what happens within Salford. Like I say, each different local authority is chalk and cheese, really, I suppose. So it's really understanding that that network within your area. I think we're quite fortunate because we've had a very proactive infrastructure organisation. Salford CVS is actually 103 years old. So we've been really well established within that within Salford. We've got a great relationship with the local authority. We used to have a Salford Clinical Commissioning Group, but that's recently been transformed across to a Greater Manchester wide one. So we're in an interesting situation where we're still forming new relationships as well with that. We're a decently sized organisation. We've got about 50 employees, I suppose, working on different projects. The Wellbeing Matters mental health programme, which I work on, that's probably one of the biggest because that employs, I would say, around about 12 people out of that 50 or so. So probably about a quarter of the workforce work on that. But like I say, there are infrastructure organisations across the country, things like also, national organisations, within, the voluntary sector, things like Social Enterprises UK, they can all offer support and help you. So I think that covers my section, really, I suppose. It's down to any questions that anybody.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. That's great. I just wanted to emphasise there that Martin's not been at Salford CVS from its beginning. I know.
Thank you, Ian.
But also just to point out the environmental or the environment forum which took place last Friday, setting up that networking is really important. We're looking at trying to set up initially a WhatsApp group of people who are involved so they can ask quick questions, get support, and then if there's any more in-depth questions, is that we're going to look at trying to do quarterly meetings and also have access to sort of email dialogue. And the social value aspect, I think that Martin touched on there about being able to trade between organisations. So if you, certainly for us, buying Salford keeping the pound. There's that term about the sticky pound of it staying within your local network is a great way of being able to sell your organisation.
It's Ian, and it's one of the, when we're assessing funding bids, etc., and grant applications, it is one of the criteria that we look at actually as well, is keeping the money within the local economy. Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, it really is. So thank you very much, Gary, and thank you very much, Martin. So it's over really to you guys out there now, is to, if you've any questions, we're actually not doing bad here for time. We're up at 7 o'clock. So we've got 15 minutes of Q&A if anybody's got any questions they want to pose. I'm not too sure, Claire, how's the best way of handling the questions?
I made note of some of the ones, because there has been some throughout the chat. I know you said you directly messaged somebody, but I think there's some that probably like other people would like answering. So should I just read those out, and then if there's anything we've missed, people can take themselves off mute and ask them. So there was one around what issues are there around change of use of planning permission?
Well, I suppose I've had experience of for us, the piece of land that we've got, which we literally just about to sign the lease for this week. And we've been operating out of there for the past 2 and a bit years, nearly 3 years. We were able to get support from an organisation called LawWorks, so that might be worth investigating. If anybody's looking at maybe doing an asset transfer of some council asset, is LawWorks offered free legal advice. I mean, I must admit, this has been a long journey. It's been over 2 years, this journey. But they will then allocate you somebody who can support that journey, and they will make sure that lease and contract is fit for purpose, and then we share that out across our board just to check that we're all happy with that. It has been a change of use, because it was a council plant nursery, and obviously we're now operating a cafe out of that. So we have had some experience of that. So happy to take on, if somebody got further questions about that, just let me know and drop us an email, or
I think one of the main ones, Ian, is obviously to be in regular contact with the local authority or the landlord who you're looking at doing that asset transfer from. Local authorities are quite risk averse, so that they tend to produce these big legal documents, etc. And I know, for example, Salford's legal team sort of outsource a lot of that to Greater Manchester, to Manchester City Councils, and that creates delays, etc. However, when you speak to the officers, they're really keen to sort of like, to make sure that any potential sites are developed to the full potential. Certainly if you've got things like derelict areas that you're looking at taking over, that they've got targets about sort of bringing derelict land back into public use, etc. You're part of the green infrastructure there, and with regard to sort of their carbon footprint, etc. So they're really keen to to engage with organisations, like I say, especially if you've got a good idea that you can take forward and help them achieve their aims and objectives.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Sorry, go on, Gary. Off mute. You're on mute, mate.
I'm just going to chip in on 2 things there about sorts of planning permission generally. One is a very practical experience. In our community shops, we tend to take over unused community assets, and we have to change them to planning consent A1 retail, which can be a bit tricky. My experience of that is there's 2 stakeholder groups that you've got to spend a lot of time drinking cups of tea with. The people who will grant you the planning permission, so that's all the folks at the local authority that you need to spend a lot of time with, and the people who might oppose the planning permission, which is the entire community around about there. So I think most of that is politics, honestly. I think, if you're doing a thing that's got social value and those 2 stakeholder groups don't get the social value that it will deliver, the onus is on you to articulate that better and to work those 2 stakeholder groups. On the issue of land in particular, as a director of Incredible Edible, incredibleedible.org.uk. Jump on the website and have a look at the section called The Right to Grow. So we've just launched in Parliament 3 months ago a major systems change campaign that is about inserting into national legislation and into local cabinet and local authority cabinet decisions the right to grow. This is not the right to own the land, but it is the right to grow as first refusal on all publicly held land by councils, local authorities, housing associations, any land which is designated as public land. Have a read of that on the Incredible Edible website, so incredibleedible.org.uk, right to grow. I'm not asking you to get involved in Incredible Edible. I'm saying we've had a really clever team of international barristers do a piece of work for free for us to attempt to change the law. Because at the moment, it's a battle to get organisations to agree to allow the public to grow on public land. Whereas what it should be is it should be a battle for somebody to take that land which is public and build houses for profit on it. However, somehow it seems a lot easier for those organisations to get their hands on that land than for ordinary citizens to get their hands on the land to grow food for themselves. So I'm not going to go on to the whole thing, but particularly with regard to using land, there's some really interesting work going on about the right for citizens to utilise public realm in order to grow food and not to be prevented from doing so.
I've just shared that link in the chat.
Another thing I would state as well, everybody, is if there is a new development that's happened near to where you're looking at developing your site, explore the option with the local authority about Section 106 funding. And Section 106 funding is where a developer has to make a contribution to the local community as part of their development, as part of their corporate social responsibility. And quite often, if it's a large housing estate, there can be quite substantial sums of money that the builder has to, the property developer or land developer has to contribute to the local economy. So have a look at that as well.
A really good tip. Thank you. Unless either you have any more, there was a question about volunteering and finding and keeping volunteers. If anybody has any tips on that one.
I'm just reading there from Nadja that one of my concerns is finding and keeping local volunteers. Yeah, it is a massive issue. We have some amazing volunteers, and you know what? I honestly do not know what the real answer is to how you retain, because we have one amazing volunteer who's been with us now for 18 months, awesome person who comes every day that we're open and just loves and embraces it. And then you will get a number of people who will promise you the earth that they're going to be able to help you with this, that, and the other, and they attend for one session and you never see them again. Now, Gary might say that's me.
Well, I'm going to say the opposite, because I've spent a lot of time with our 150-ish, probably more time with 80 or 90, not all of them, groups across the UK. And I would say, without making Ian feel too embarrassed, he's a great example of doing that. And I think basically there's a balance. So some organisations make it feel like the organisation is a thing that people volunteer for. And somebody else runs the organisation and I come and give my time for free to the organisation. Ian and a few other select leaders that you can see around the UK, and there's some good examples, help people feel like we are all equal members of a movement that's doing something together. And I know that sounds a bit ethereal, but there is a fundamental difference between an organisation that is distinct from the activity of the people for whom I give my time for free to, and if I disappear from doing it, the organisation will just have to carry on without my time, and the culture of an organization which says we're just a group of people who are part of a movement for change. Every one of our contributions is equally important. And those leaders who deliver that message tend to have people who are happy and willing and participate and feel the onus in them as much as anybody else. And those hierarchical structures who say, well, you can come and give your time for free on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, but frankly, if you don't, it's just about loving and nurturing and helping people feel part of a movement and not giving their time for free as a transaction. And Ian's a great example of that. And there are lots more of those. But I would have to say also, there are some pretty poor examples of that as well, where people feel disengaged, like it's somebody else's job if I don't come.
I think one of the crucial things is actually sort of like celebrating their achievements and what they've done and the contribution they've made, and making that recognizing that. I think that's really important. I mean, as a infrastructure organization, we have annual awards for volunteers that we give out, certificates to people that have done X number of hours, etc. So it's, you know, and we want to work with the organizations to make sure that they recognize the value of their volunteers, you know, on a regular basis. We even have some funding that we can distribute to organizations for an event to celebrate, you know, volunteering in those organizations, and to thank them for the input that they've given. So yeah, so it's really important to recognize the value that those volunteers have made to the organization.
I see Margaret's got a hand up. I just wanted to give a response to that just before Margaret comes in and asks, so contributes to that question. We sort of celebrate the volunteer activities. We have a WhatsApp group for the group of volunteers, so I can share pictures, stories. We can also just generally chat to each other, but regularly send out a WhatsApp saying thanks for your contribution today, and you know, we can't really do what we do without you. And also on our social media, so actually on our Facebook this afternoon is a lovely creation by one of our amazing volunteers, and you know, we state we can't really, we've not have achieved what we've got so far without that bunch of volunteers. Margaret, do you want to come in and ask your question? You're muted, Margaret, if you are speaking. No, Margaret's got a hand up.
It may have been an accidental hand. We've all done that at times.
Ah, right, okay. There was a more local question from Sue to Martin with regards to green social prescribing pilot. How long is it running for, and is there plans for it to continue?
It's only on at the moment a pilot. The pilot runs through till March next year, although there's we're in negotiation and discussions about extending it for a further 18 months. And part of the reason certainly on the green social prescribing, I should say, is the fact that, you know, the last 6 months of that pilot scheme are during the winter time, really, you know, from, you know, September through to December, then January, February, March, which is obviously not the most productive time for nature-based activities. So that's one of the reasons for trying to get that extended. But currently, it's only running through to March next year. But I think that we've hopefully managing to evidence the benefits of it so that we can continue doing it for a much longer period.
Great, thank you. Was there anything else there, Claire? I've tried to scroll down questions. I don't know if anybody's got any face-to-face questions you want to ask. You're muted, Claire.
Sorry, I think we answered most of them like during the presentations. If anybody else doesn't think we have, then please come off mute and shout up.
Hello.
Hi, Margaret.
Margaret here. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah, no, it's just about the volunteers. I started a community garden about 5 years ago, and most of them there's 5 core, and they've stayed for about 3 or 4 or 5. And it's the value that you have, and that they feel that they are creating it as well. You know, you're sort of directing it, but they're creating it with you, and that you couldn't do it without them. Also, to make them feel very welcome. You know, never sort of say, oh, haven't seen you in ages, you know, things like that. It makes all the difference, because you don't know what's going on in their life or what, you know, what's happening. So you leave it open for them to come back, but they seem to do it anyway, and it's wonderful. It really is wonderful.
Thank you.
Also,
Okay.
I find it men of a particular age like to feel needed and wanted and use their skills still. I'm sorry if that's not PC, but they really do feel when they retire, they really want to be doing something. So if it's worthwhile, they'll get behind you and come as if it was their job, you know. But I have a retired joiner, and I can't think up enough things for him to make. So I'm very, very lucky there. Very lucky. But it's great talking to you all today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Ian, we've got a question on the chat from Wendy, and then we've got Sue with a hand up as well. So
Is there any quick funding available for winter? Again, it's very sort of specific to locations. So I suppose the question is, what specifically are you looking for? So Gary's just put an answer out there as well. I've shared the Salford CVS website for funding as well. But again, it depends on what it is you're thinking of funding, whether it's a green and growing project or it's got a specific remit. But again, I can only really recommend is have a look at the Salford CVS website at their funding, and if you scroll down the funding page, there's lots of national organisations that have their information on there as well, which you will be able to access. Obviously, you won't be able to access the local funding, but sort of national stuff will be on there. So it's Sue. Was it Sue? Hiya, Sue. Do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, it was just a follow up really to my question about the green prescribing pilots that have been going on around the country.
Yep.
I was sort of angling at whether Martin thinks that they might be spread out to other areas. Given if they've been successful in the pilots so far.
It would be if it was in my pay scale.
That's nice to know.
I don't honestly know, to be honest with you. I mean, the ones that on a national basis, I'm trying to think off the top of my head where they are. There's one in Derby, one in South Yorkshire, a couple down in London, etc. So they dotted all around the country, to be honest with you. And like I say, Greater Manchester was chosen, and even within Greater Manchester, there's 10 local authorities, and 4 of those have been selected, and it's primarily because of the way that they had to put a bid in, and each one of them is a slightly different, is a different model to each other. So at Salford CVS, we're not actually a delivery partner on that. We're sort of like conducting the orchestra, I suppose, for want of an analogy. Whereas in the other areas in Greater Manchester, the organisations that were successful with that funding bid are actually delivering it directly themselves. So one of our strengths was the fact that we've got this network of 900 plus community organisations that are members of Salford CVS, and we've got a really good broad range of sort of like delivery partners, quality delivery partners that could deliver social prescribing activities, because we needed to make sure that. So, for example, in the green social prescribing, one of the criteria that I was advising, because I wasn't obviously part of the panel because I'm too close to the groups, but things like an organisation must have space where they must have all the policies and procedures in place. That's obviously goes without saying, but it also must have a space where if there can be an indoor activity in the space, in the case of inclement weather, that they've experienced people there who know how to meet and greet and treat and work with people that are experiencing things like isolation, mild forms of mental ill health, etc., through sort of anxiety or depression, and they've experienced working with people like that. And that's you need to sort of evidence that in part of any of your funding bids that you your proposal that you put forward to get any social prescribing type of activities. So, things like, toilet facilities, etc.
Mm,
So, we made sure that those organizations have got the basics in place so that people can go along, and some people might just go along and sit down in a corner and have a cup of coffee and wander around and just have sort of like some contemplation time. And then again, that's fine. But it's even better still if you start integrating them into the work that those organizations do, because part of the social prescribing is the social bit. It's to address those things, those isolation, and people's mental well-being through social interaction.
Yeah, I used to work in Salford, so I'm aware of the NHS is very enlightened there about
Yes.
supporting
Yeah.
therapeutic horticulture. But where I'm working now in Lancashire, there's a lot, as you say, of small local groups who invite people in and try and support people who are lonely and got sort of mental health problems, but they haven't actually got the funding or the support to do that. And I think that's the thing we're looking for.
Yeah, and with the pilots within Greater Manchester, some organisations are literally paid by referral. Other ones have been supported through, a cash input really to make sure that they can deliver, activities, between now and the end of March or Christmas time, whenever they decided that they want to run the programs through to.
Yeah. Right. Well, I hope it spreads more widely anyway, but it sounds like yours has been very successful. So
well, I say we've had meetings with I think in fact we've got another one later on in the week actually with the NHS, to try and sort of reinforce the benefits of nature-based solutions for people. Really, it's been very well evidenced anyway. So hopefully, it's just a case of and. The other thing about social prescribing, and I've been having a chat with Ian about this earlier on today, a number of people self-refer into a program, and that's a difficult part to evidence. If it comes from a referral from the GP, we employ, I think it's about 12 we link workers, community connectors who understand their local environment really well. So they know which green projects are based in each of the, they have a chat about what really matters to those clients when they come in. What would you like to do? What did you used to do? When you were younger, etc. Does anything? Any outdoor activities? You fancy doing some of these activities? If you ever contemplated, thought about going on a, doing some horticulture. You don't need to be a good gardener to do it. You'll learn some new skills, etc. as you're going through that process. But you'll also meet new friends. You'll be involved in some great worthwhile environmental projects, etc. So that they're the people who do the referrals. Yeah, but there's a number of people who self-refer, so they don't go through that GP's practice because of the stigma involved in that. Might be one barrier. Another one is the fact that a lot of people that go through this process, at the moment, there's social issues, around things like debt, heating, food poverty, etc., that you've got to overcome before you can, they're in a place where they can start contemplating a nature-based, social prescription activity. You've got to get them into that. It's part of Maslow's hierarchy of need. You've got to put those basics in place before they can contemplate something like, working in going to a nature-based activity for their own mental health and well-being. They've got to put roofs over their head and feed the kids, etc. So those social issues are very pressing at the moment, as everybody can appreciate.
Thank you, Martin. That's great. You took me back to my teaching trainer days then with that pedagogy then. Thank you, Maslow. Thank you. Margaret, your hand's still up. I'm guessing that's from before, unless you want. Again, I think we've pretty much covered all the questions, and we're also coming up to time.
Yeah.
So just thank you to everybody. We hope that was useful. Lots of positive comments in the chat. Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much, Martin, for your contributions. Thank you, Claire, for your technical support. Claire, if you want to, I'll stay on for a minute. We'll just have a chat. Gary, you're welcome to stay, or Martin, you're welcome to stay, but certainly won't be here for too long. Thank you, everybody else, and have a lovely evening. And if there's any further questions, I'm sure there's some way of contacting us. If you do want to switch your cameras back on just to wave goodbye. That'd be lovely. Hello, Helen in Lucian. Hello, Jill. Hello, hello, hello. So yeah, thank you very much, guys, and have a lovely evening. And take care and do some wonderful green and growing stuff out there. Bye bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye bye.